that has not changed either in all these centuries, right?
Great.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was told to give some introductory remark and say something, introduce myself and say, who am I? And basically for me, that's kind of the fundamental question for understanding issues with the forum online. I like Mitch's characterization that there's this lack of prana online. Because I come from Boston, we don't really think in these terms, so this was a very refreshing way of coming out to California and thinking, yes, there's this lack of prana here. Because when you think about what you really see of other people online, this is kind of the extent, often if you're in a forum, of how their identity is represented. When I've taught classes, one of the first exercises I give to my students is ask them to draw two pictures. I say, draw a picture of a conversation that you see happening in the real world and draw a picture of an online conversation. And almost invariably, the picture that people draw of conversations in the real world focuses on people. And there might be something about the words they spoke, but it's really identity-based. And when people think about conversations online, it's a lot of words, it's mixed in, and maybe they'll use different colors for other speakers, but the identities tend to be fairly unimportant. And at heart, I think one of the reasons we have such difficulty getting the type of discourse or experiences, not just in the quality of the discourse, but in the type of engagement online, has to do with how we present and think about and value online identity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about identity for the few minutes here. So one piece that I've been really interested in, here's a whole bunch of my identities, still in this not very rich format of the email address. But early on, one of the earliest papers that I wrote about this, a whole other long talk, is about applying signaling theory from biology and about how this relates to antelopes that jump up and down, but we'll get to that maybe in the discussion. But that some of these also tie you very strictly into a real-life identity. So the first two there are these academic affiliations. So you see this, you know something about me, about my affiliations. It also gives a level of responsibility. When I first started writing about this, it was at an interesting time in the history of online forums of when Usenet went from being the domain primarily of academics and computer professionals and engineers to being opened up, particularly by AOL, when all of a sudden there was an influx of people not only who weren't part of the shared culture, but who had cheap throwaway online identities. And so even this little tiny thing like an email address, if you start thinking about its meaning in terms of identity, can be a very rich space. Because something that has, I just looked, I did a quick Google search early on, cheap email address. There's places you can get email addresses that last for 15 minutes and expire. So you can do something and then be untraceable. But even so, the little bit of that domain in that space tells you a lot about the cost that that person may occur through, for instance, behaving really badly, or the value of the reputation they have behind them. On Usenet, if you said something really vicious with your corporate or educational email address, it could come back and be tied to a real-world person, where a throwaway email address didn't. So that's one aspect of identity. All these things that are about what ties you to being a particular individual, and some of these are your driver's license, social security number, your DNA, perhaps the cell phone number that all babies will soon be given at birth if they can sort of follow through at life. But one of the things here, except for little bits of things, certainly somewhere in DNA is a great deal of knowledge about you and perhaps your personality and all kinds of predictive things. We don't have any way of reading that. That's a picture of DNA in the background, if you didn't recognize it, one of its renderings. Your cell phone number says very little about you. So a lot of what we really want to know about other people is more along the line of social identity, not just who specifically you are, or maybe that's not even important, but the idea of what kind of person are you. And so these are just some references to some of the key words in this area. It's also one of the things that, because as I said, the topic of this talk is me, is a way of saying, okay, when I see a slide like this, I know that's an academic. Who else would put up, a slide with properly formatted references? So slowly you just start to get these hints about who other people are from what you see of them. And in the real world, it's a fairly rich domain of things. These are just different pictures. I'm sure if we went around the room and said, please tell me a story about all those different people, you could give me a whole rich idea of their background, where they are, their political views. You know nothing about them except what a picture of them looks like. and that's what's similar, first reference in the previous slide, was talking about when he said, how is society possible? He was interested in that question of how, when we see these tiny glimpses of other people, how do we form a full opinion of who they are? What are the ways we tie in some notion of, given basically our underlying stereotypes of who they are? You know, Lakoff has extended this work with his categorizations. And it's one of those things that's both this promise and problem online. You know, one of some of the earliest writings of the sort of cyber utopian vein was about how we were inventing this whole new world where you could have a forum, you could have discussions, but not immediately know what is the race, gender, age, etc. of the people you're talking to. That without those things that would tend to make you have immediate impressions about how believable they should be, we would have a society that was based on people's words. I think there's still some truth in it, though we still haven't understood the promise of it, in part because we haven't substituted anything rich for it. While we don't necessarily have all those cues that might lend us to dismiss someone out of hand, unfortunately, what we don't have is a good understanding of the history of what they're saying. And so some of the work that I've been interested in pursuing is how do we make alternative representations to the online world. This is something Mitch and I can debate because I know he's interested in the sort of virtual world of the more Second Life-esque one, and this is a more abstract representation. But here's sort of, this is, you know, this morning's public feed on Twitter. You have no idea who these people are. You might be able to click on these tweets, but it's still very much a word-based, post-based, here we are broadcasting a little bit version out. This is a front end to Twitter that one of my students did called Lexigraphs. And here what you get is for each person, you see this profile of what are the words and phrases on one side that they use most commonly, and the other side is what are their most recent ones. What I find interesting about this is it's certainly not a way of reading Twitter, but imagine coming in to into work and seeing this whole wall is sort of constantly updated. What are different people doing? Who's really lively right now? What are they talking about? So the whole notion of a slightly different take on it that's very people-focused. I'm going to do something I do not usually do, which is try and bring something up online because it's always so dubious. But this is another piece that we did as part. Ooh, that's so annoying. All right. Well, we'll try and do that some other time. Maybe I'll run it in a background when someone else is here. But and it's lost my PowerPoint for me. Sorry, guys. That's why I never try and do anything live. Thought I would try this once. But
it's part of the experience.
What?
Sorry, I was just saying that is part of the experience,
yes.
Network errors.
Yeah. So anyway, Personas is a project that we did as part of a larger art project that does a characterization of who you are online. If you're sitting here with your computer and a real network connection, than what I have here, try it. It's personas.media.mit.edu. You can put in a name, and it goes through Google and says, who are you? But what's interesting here is this was an art project. It wasn't meant to be a final piece, is that the computer characterizes you in different ways. It tries to both figure out everything Google knows about you, but then starts to put it in order. And so some of what it's doing is also reminding us that no matter what, once we have this huge amount of information, we then develop tools to make it more accessible. And those tools themselves may be somewhat faulty. So if you see, if you have a name like Jim Smith, it will collapse all the Jim Smiths together, as for instance, the TSA will often do for you. And so we're moving now to developing versions of this for reading online forums, for looking at different opinion space-like questions of how do you start making sense of what people are doing online, etc. But anyway, my time is up, but that was sort of a quick introduction to the question of identity and fora. Thank you.